Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty huge. I mean, it's a big part of what makes us human, right?
Yeah.
Gender and sexuality. We've got all this fascinating research, and it really gets into how those things, those core parts of who we are actually shaped.
Yeah, it's like we've got this wide lens, looking at everything. I mean, from biology to like how society impacts us, even how our own minds work. It's pretty amazing how much goes into it all. We're even going to explore how gender and sexuality develop as we grow, and then get into like, those deeper aspects of sexual orientation, behavior, all that.
So we're going to be extracting what's really insightful and relevant for you, the listener, right?
Yeah.
Like we want to help you understand yourself better, but also, the world around us, all those different people and perspectives.
Exactly.
Okay, so where should we start, I guess, with like understanding gender itself? What is gender?
Well, it's one of those things that sounds simple at first, but when you start digging in, it actually gets kind of complicated.
Right.
So, like, when we talk about gender, we got to differentiate a few things. You have gender itself, right? Which is more about the characteristics that society links to being male or female. But then you have gender identity. That's your own personal feeling, like deep down, of being male, female, maybe both, maybe neither, maybe somewhere on the spectrum.
Right, right.
And then there are these things called gender roles, right? Which are all about what society expects from us, how we're supposed to think and act and feel based on being male or female. And then finally, there's gender typing, which is basically the whole process of how we learn and internalize all those roles.
Yeah, and it's kind of mind-blowing how early some of that starts. Like I was reading that gender identity might actually emerge before kids are even 2 years old.
Yeah.
And then, like, as they hit those preschool years, you start to see that sex-type behavior.
Yeah.
Boys wanting to play with trucks and girls wanting to play dress-up, all
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
And they were even saying that if kids are really, really into the stereotypical things early on, like that can carry over into, even early elementary school.
Absolutely. And, when we think about what shapes all this, well, we got to start with biology, right? It's like the foundation. We're
Yeah.
talking about chromosomes, the XX and the XY thing, of course, the hormones.
Yeah.
You have estrogens, like the big one, estradiol, and that's mainly involved in developing female physical characteristics. But then you have androgens, with the most famous one being testosterone, and that promotes male development.
And this is where it gets so interesting, right? So like in those first weeks of pregnancy, male and female embryos, they look basically the same.
Yeah.
And then there's this gene on the Y chromosome that's like a trigger. And if it's there, it directs some tissue to become, testes.
Right.
And then those testes start pumping out testosterone. But without that Y chromosome, the tissue just naturally develops into ovaries.
It's pretty wild. And, to really see how powerful these biological influences can be, researchers have actually looked at cases where people are exposed to different, like, atypical levels of these sex hormones while they're developing.
Okay, yeah, like what?
Well, a good example is this condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH. And it happens in girls.
Okay.
So basically, it's a genetic thing where their adrenal glands, they produce way too many androgens. And this starts even before they're born.
So what happens to those girls?
Well, even though they are genetically XX female, right? Their genitals, they can develop in a way that appears more, male typical.
Right.
Sometimes they even do surgery to, make them appear more typically female.
Wow.
But it's the behavioral stuff that is really fascinating.
I bet.
Studies show that these girls with CAH, they often say they're less happy with being female. They're more interested in like boy activities and toys, like sports. And they'd rather hang out with boys than girls and might not be into dolls or makeup and things like that. They've also found that these girls might be more aggressive, have more behavioral problems, more likely to get diagnosed with ADHD, and they're even less likely to do those like pro-social things, like helping others.
So it's like even though there's this biological predisposition, there's still this interaction with social norms and interventions. It's like nature and nurture are all tangled up.
Exactly. And there's even more to the biological side. Researchers have looked at typical hormone variations, within the normal range. Like they measured testosterone in amniotic fluid during pregnancy,
Oh, wow.
And they found that higher levels were linked to more of those male typical play styles, like more aggression in kids between 6 and 10. And this was regardless of whether the child was biologically male or female.
Oh, interesting.
And even earlier, like in 3-year-old boys, higher prenatal testosterone was linked to less patience, like waiting for things, and more attention problems.
So it really seems like biology has a big role in shaping some of these gender-related behaviors. But then you also have the evolutionary psychology perspective, which is a whole other way of thinking about it.
Right, right.
They're basically saying that because males and females had different roles in reproduction, throughout human history, it created different evolutionary pressures.
Exactly. Like for males, having more partners meant they were more likely to pass on their genes. So natural selection favored guys who were into short-term mating and who, competed for resources to attract females.
Right.
And evolutionary psychologists think that's why males might be naturally more competitive, risk-taking, and maybe even more prone to violence.
But it's important to remember that a lot of social scientists push back on that purely biological explanation.
Oh, absolutely.
They say that our social experiences are what really drive those psychological differences between genders. It's not just what we're born with, it's about what we learn and experience as we grow up.
Yeah, and within those social influence theories, there are a bunch of different approaches. Like there's psychoanalytic theory, that Freud stuff,
Right.
which basically says that little kids, they develop this attraction to the opposite sex parent, and then when they're like 5 or 6, they start identifying with the same sex parent. But there's a lot of pushback against that now.
Like what?
Well, for one, kids show signs of gender typing way earlier than that. And they can develop masculine or feminine traits, even if that same-sex parent isn't always around.
Right.
So that throws a wrench in things.
Yeah.
The theory that's more accepted these days is social cognitive theory. And that emphasizes that kids learn those gender roles by watching and imitating others, and also by getting rewarded or punished for behaviors that are seen as, appropriate or not for their genders.
So it's about what they see and the feedback they get.
Exactly. And, parents, they play a big role in this, whether they realize it or not. They use rewards and punishments to guide their kids towards what they see as feminine or masculine. Think about a parent praising their little girl for playing quietly with her dolls or telling their son, "Big boys don't cry." It's all about that gender typing, how kids learn and internalize those societal expectations.
And there's been research showing that moms and dads often interact differently with their kids based on gender.
Yeah, for sure.
Like moms tend to be more involved overall, more focused on caring and teaching.
Right.
While dads, even though they might be more hands-on with sons, they usually do more like fun activities with their kids.
It's interesting, right? And when you look at how parents specifically socialize their kids along those gender lines, there are some pretty clear patterns.
What have they found?
Well, Phyllis Bronstein did some really important research on this, and she found that, across a lot of cultures, moms tend to raise their daughters to be more obedient and responsible, and they're more likely to, restrict their daughter's independence.
Oh, interesting.
While dads, they tend to pay more attention to their sons, do more stuff with them, and really emphasize, intellectual development.
Wow. So there are these clear differences in how parents treat their sons and daughters.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, Bronstein even said that despite us being more aware of those negative stereotypes, a lot of parents still push those traditional gender roles. It's like these deep-seated ideas are hard to shake.
It's true. And, it's not just parents who influence us. Kids also pick up cues from other adults, and then there's the media. Like from TV shows to social media, it all plays a huge role in shaping how they see gender.
Right. But as kids get older, their peers become even more important, right?
Oh, yeah.
They're constantly reinforcing those gender norms.
Yeah.
Rewarding what they see as appropriate and criticizing or even rejecting kids who don't fit in. And it's interesting how it seems more okay for girls to do things that are traditionally masculine. Like tomboy isn't as bad of a word as sissy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There was even this study with 9 and 10-year-olds. And the boys who didn't fit those traditional expectations, they were most likely to get rejected by their peers. While the girls who didn't conform, sometimes they were actually preferred because they were good at those masculine activities.
It's so interesting how that works. And another fascinating thing is what happens in same-sex play groups, which are super common between 4 and 12 years old.
Right.
Researchers have seen that when boys play with other boys, their activity levels go up, they do more roughhousing, and they're all about those toys that are marketed for boys. And it's the opposite with all girl groups. Their activity and aggression might actually go down, and they're more into that, traditional feminine play.
Like they create their own little worlds.
Yeah. There's even a study that called the Playground Gender School, because those interactions really reinforce those gender-typed behaviors. And this whole thing about preferring same-sex friendships, it actually continues into adulthood.
Makes you wonder how much of it is nature and how much is nurture, right?
It's the big question.
And we can't forget about schools. Right.
Yeah.
Like, how does gender bias play out in the classroom?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag.
In what way?
Well, we see that boys are more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities or ADHD. They drop out of school more, and teachers are quicker to criticize them and see them as troublemakers.
Right.
But then girls are usually more well-behaved in class.
Which sounds good, but...
Yeah, but some people worry that it stops them from being assertive and speaking up.
Right.
Boys also tend to demand more attention, so teachers often end up spending more time with them, giving them more help, even more time to answer questions.
So it's like there are different kinds of biases at play.
Definitely. And then there's this concerning trend where girls' self-esteem takes a nosedive during middle school.
Yeah, it's a tough time. So it sounds like both boys and girls are getting hit by these unintentional biases in different ways. And the key is that a lot of teachers might not even realize they're doing it.
Yeah, that's the scary part.
It seems like making teachers aware of these biases and giving them training on how to avoid them is really important.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the whole debate about single-sex education.
Right.
You know, there's been a big increase in single-sex public schools, partly because people think that separating boys and girls will mean fewer distractions and less harassment.
Makes sense.
And they also think it might help low-income students of color do better academically, especially with all that pressure from No Child Left Behind.
Okay, so does it actually work?
Well, that's the thing. When you look at the high-quality research, they haven't found any clear evidence that single-sex education leads to better grades compared to co-ed schools.
Really?
Yeah. There's even a study that calls it, get this, the pseudoscience of single-sex schooling. They say that separating kids actually makes it harder for them to learn how to work together in a school setting.
But what about those programs for African-American boys, like Urban Prep Academy? They seem to be doing really well.
Yeah, that's an important point. Their graduation rates and college enrollment numbers are impressive, especially given the tough backgrounds a lot of those boys come from.
Right.
So it's too early to say if that model can be used everywhere and work for everyone.
Okay.
But the success of programs like Urban Prep, it does suggest that maybe targeted approaches, including single-sex settings, could help specific groups of students who are facing unique challenges.
Okay, so we've talked about biology and social influences, but what about how our minds work? Like the cognitive side of gender. Some researchers say that social cognitive theory doesn't fully account for how kids themselves think about gender.
Yeah, that's where cognitive theories like gender schema theory come in.
Okay.
This idea is all about how kids actively build these things called gender schemas in their minds. They're basically mental frameworks, sets of beliefs that they use to make sense of the world based on what they think it means to be male or female.
So it's like mental shortcuts for figuring out gender.
Exactly. Like, think about how little kids see jobs. Researchers asked kids as young as 3 or 4, who would be better at this job, a man or a woman? And even at that age, they already have strong gender schemas.
Wow.
They often think men are better at masculine jobs and women at feminine jobs. And it's even more telling when you ask them how they'd feel about doing those jobs when they grow up.
Right, like would they be happy or sad or what?
Exactly. Girls often say they'd be happy in those traditionally feminine roles, but they get angry or grossed out at the thought of a masculine job. And boys are the opposite. And what's interesting is that boys have a much stronger negative reaction to being in a feminine role than girls do to being in a masculine one.
It shows how deep-seated those beliefs can be, even at such a young age. But the good news is that as kids grow up and become teenagers and adults, their thinking about gender roles and stuff usually becomes more flexible.
That's encouraging.
It really makes you wonder if we can use education to challenge those stereotypes and promote more gender equality in how we think.
It's a question worth exploring. Now let's move on to gender stereotypes themselves.
Okay, so those are the general impressions and often oversimplified beliefs that we have about males and females. And they're everywhere, shaping our expectations and judgments, even when they're not true.
Exactly. There was this classic study back in the 70s where they asked college students to list the traits they associated with each sex. And the traits linked to males were called instrumental. Stuff like being independent, aggressive, focused on power and achievement.
Okay.
But the traits for females were called expressive. Things like being warm, sensitive, and caring about relationships.
And you can see how those stereotypes match up with the old school ideas about men being breadwinners and women being caregivers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that these aren't just neutral descriptions. They have a lot to do with social status and power.
For sure.
Historically, and even today, those feminine characteristics are often seen as less important, like women are less competent or more dependent, while masculine traits are associated with, competence, authority, being higher up in society.
It's true. And those stereotypes start forming early. Research shows that kids as young as 2 can be aware of gender stereotypes, and it really ramps up by age 4. And get this, one study found that when kids learn about both genders, not just one, it actually makes them stereotype more between the ages of 2 and 3.
So learning about both genders makes them stereotype more. That's surprising.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. So how do these stereotypes change as we get older, like in childhood and adolescence?
Well, in middle and late childhood, things get a bit more flexible, but it depends on the area.
Okay.
Some research even says that girls might become more flexible than boys in their gender typing. Like, one study looked at kids between 3 and 10, and they found that girls and older kids were more likely to believe those stereotypes. But girls focused more on looks, while boys focused on activities and personality.
Interesting.
Then when kids become teenagers, those stereotypes might get stronger again for a bit, maybe because of social pressure. But things usually loosen up again by late adolescence as they figure out who they are.
It's a roller coaster.
It is.
So we have all these stereotypes, but what does science actually say about gender similarities and differences? I mean, it's important to remember that when we're talking about differences, we're talking about averages in big groups of people. And there's a lot of overlap between males and females.
Absolutely. Like, any differences we see could be because of biology, culture, or both.
Right. So what about physical differences?
Well, there are some obvious ones, like on average, women have about twice as much body fat as men.
Right.
And it's distributed differently, more around the breasts and hips, while men store more fat in their bellies. Men are also about 10% taller on average. That's mainly because of androgens, those hormones that help bones grow during puberty. Estrogens eventually stop that growth in females.
And there's also that connection between gender and health. Like, from the moment they're conceived, females tend to live longer and are less likely to get certain diseases.
That's true.
They're also better at fighting off infections, and their blood vessels are more elastic. But men have higher levels of stress hormones, which can affect things like blood clotting and blood pressure.
Right. And when you look at the brain, things get even more complicated.
Okay.
There are some average differences between male and female brains. Like, there's this part of the hypothalamus, which controls sexual behavior, that's bigger in men.
Okay.
And a part of the parietal lobe, which is about spatial skills, is also often bigger in men.
Right.
The areas that process emotions might be more active in females. And although male brains are about 10% bigger overall, female brains have more folds and grooves, which means more surface area.
So it's not just about size.
Exactly. But a lot of these brain differences are actually really small, and studies sometimes have different results. There's this idea of a gender mosaic brain now.
Gender mosaic?
Yeah, meaning that brains have a mix of features we associate with both males and females. There's a ton of overlap. And importantly, even when we find differences in brain structure or activity, we don't always know what they mean for how people think or behave. It's probably both biology and experience that shape our brains.
Makes sense. So what about cognitive differences, like thinking and learning?
The big finding there is that there's no real difference in general intelligence between genders.
Okay.
But there are some average differences in specific areas, though some experts, like Janet Shibley-Hyde, say these differences are blown out of proportion.
Right.
Like with spatial skills, yeah. Some studies say men are slightly better on average.
Right.
But there's so much overlap that many women will actually be better than many men at those same tasks. And interestingly, identifying strongly with a masculine gender role is linked to better spatial skills in both sexes. And when it comes to math, large studies and national tests consistently show almost no gender difference in scores.
So those stereotypes about girls being bad at math, they don't hold up.
Not really.
What about the social and emotional side of things? That's where a lot of those gender stereotypes really dig in.
Yeah, for sure. With aggression, studies show that men are physically more aggressive on average. But the difference isn't huge, according to those meta-analyses, which combine results from lots of studies.
Okay.
And then there's relational aggression, which is about hurting someone by messing with their relationships, like spreading rumors or excluding them. That gets more common in middle and late childhood. It's not clear if girls do it more overall, but it does seem to make up a bigger part of their aggression compared to boys.
Interesting.
Also, girls are more relationally aggressive as teenagers than they are as kids, but that's not necessarily true for boys.
So it's not just physical aggression we need to think about.
Exactly. Now, with emotions, research generally says that women are more expressive and intense, better at reading others' emotions, they smile and cry more, and they report being happier. Men, on the other hand, report and express more anger.
Okay, so that kind of fits with the stereotypes.
Yeah, to some extent. Girls are usually better at recognizing and understanding emotions, and they're more empathetic. In kids, the overall differences are small, but girls do show slightly more positive and internalized emotions. And that difference in positive emotions grows as they get older. Throughout life, women are consistently better at reading facial expressions.
Interesting.
When it comes to controlling their emotions, boys often have less self-regulation than girls, which might lead to more behavioral problems.
So there are those differences in how they handle emotions, too.
Yeah. And then there are those general tendencies in terms of what people are interested in based on their gender.
Right.
Studies have found that, on average, girls are more people-oriented, meaning they're interested in relationships and jobs that involve working with people. Boys, they're more things-oriented. They prefer doing things alone and are more interested in jobs that involve tools, objects, and technical skills.
Like the classic stereotype of boys taking things apart and putting them back together.
Exactly. In adolescence, girls share more about themselves in close relationships, they're better listeners, and they value connection and belonging. Boys value being assertive and dominant in their peer groups.
So there's that social dynamic, too. But like you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of debate about these gender differences.
Oh, yeah, it's a big controversy.
What are the different sides?
Well, you have evolutionary psychologists like David Buss who say gender differences are big, and they come from those different challenges men and women face throughout human history.
Okay.
Then you have social role theorists like Alice Eagley, who also see big differences. But they say it's because of the different roles men and women have had in society and the power imbalances.
Okay.
And then there's the gender similarity view, championed by Janet Shibley-Hyde. She says we've exaggerated the differences and that when you combine lots of studies, you actually find very small or no differences in most areas, like math and communication.
So she's saying we're more similar than we think.
Basically, yeah. She says the moderate differences are in things like physical aggression, and the biggest differences are in motor skills, some aspects of sexuality, and, again, physical aggression.
So aggression seems to be the biggest difference.
Yeah, it seems so. And it's important to remember that gender isn't this isolated thing. It always exists within a specific culture and society.
Right, like different cultures have different ideas about gender roles and expectations.
Exactly. What's considered appropriate for men and women can vary a lot. Like in more traditional cultures, there might be much stronger expectations for men to be assertive and dominant and women to be submissive and nurturing. And even within a diverse country like the U.S., different ethnic and cultural backgrounds can influence how boys and girls are raised.
So even within one country, there can be lots of variation.
For sure. For example, studies show that Latino and Latina teens might have different levels of freedom compared to teens from other backgrounds.
Okay, so culture really matters. Now let's talk about how we categorize gender. It used to be that we saw masculinity and femininity as opposite ends of a spectrum, right?
Yeah, the idea was that the more masculine you were, the less feminine you were, and vice versa.
But that view has changed a lot in recent decades, hasn't it?
It has. Back in the 70s, as people became more aware of how limiting those rigid gender roles were, the idea of androgyny emerged.
Androgyny.
Right, which means having both masculine and feminine traits. You don't have to be one or the other.
So it's like a blend.
Exactly. And even more recently, we've moved beyond androgyny to an even more inclusive understanding of gender.
So it's not just about a blend anymore.
No, there's a growing acceptance that gender isn't just male or female.
Right.
Like, neuroscience is showing us that brains don't fit neatly into male or female categories.
Right, that gender mosaic idea.
Exactly. And endocrinology, the study of hormones, is finding more similarities between men and women than we thought. But the biggest change is probably in how we talk about gender identity.
Like with all the new terms and labels.
Yeah, like trans is now an umbrella term for all sorts of gender identities that differ from the sex assigned at birth.
Okay.
So you have transgender people whose inner sense of their gender doesn't match their assigned sex. Then there's genderqueer or gender expansive, which is a broader category for people who don't identify as strictly male or female.
Okay.
Gender nonconforming is for people whose behavior or appearance doesn't match what's expected for their gender. And then cisgender is for people whose gender identity does match their assigned sex.
So we have all these terms now to describe the different ways people experience gender.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that transgender people can have any sexual orientation. They can be attracted to men, women, both, neither, or other gender identities.
Right.
It's also really concerning that transgender youth face much higher rates of mental health problems like depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and eating disorders.
Yeah, that's a serious issue.
It's likely due to a mix of things, like the distress of feeling like your gender doesn't match your body, and the discrimination and lack of understanding they face.
It must be incredibly challenging.
It is. And while some transgender people choose to have medical interventions like hormone therapy or surgery to align their body with their gender, others express their gender in different ways without those interventions.
It's about finding what feels right for them.
Exactly. So we've come a long way from that simple male-female view to a more complex and inclusive understanding of gender. Now, let's talk about how gender develops across the lifespan.
Okay, so starting with childhood, it seems like boys get hit with gender socialization earlier and more intensely than girls do.
Yeah, that's what research suggests.
And there's a bigger social cost for boys who don't fit those expectations. Like, if a boy acts effeminate, it's seen as way worse than a girl acting masculine.
Yeah, it seems like the range of acceptable behavior is wider for girls. It's also been suggested that boys might have a harder time learning what it means to be masculine because they might not have consistent male role models.
Okay.
And the messages they get can be mixed. Like, parents and teachers might tell them to be tough, but also to be well-behaved and control their emotions.
This gets used.
It is. And while gender roles have become more flexible, that flexibility seems to apply more to girls than boys. Like, a girl can be praised for being ambitious and assertive, but a boy who's gentle or likes fashion might not get the same support.
It's like there's still a double standard.
Yeah, and some people are worried about this, calling it a crisis of boyhood.
A crisis of boyhood.
The idea is that there's this unspoken boy code that tells boys they can't be vulnerable and have to act tough all the time. And a lot of experts say we need to teach boys to be more comfortable with their emotions and to handle anger and aggression in healthy ways.
So we need to rethink how we raise boys.
I think so.
Yeah.
Now, moving on to adolescence, that's a huge time of change.
Yeah, with puberty and everything.
Exactly. Bodies are changing, they become more self-conscious, and there's this new awareness of how their peers see them. Plus, they're navigating romantic relationships and figuring out their sexuality. So their ideas about what it means to be male or female are evolving too.
It's a lot to handle.
It is. There's this theory called the gender intensification hypothesis that says gender differences might actually become stronger in early adolescence because of social pressure to conform.
So there's even more pressure to fit in.
Yeah, but the research on that is mixed. Some studies support it, others don't. Interestingly, one study found that boys who were very traditional actually did worse in school.
So conforming can backfire.
It can. Now, what about adulthood and aging? Do things change again?
I'm curious to know.
Yeah, let's talk about communication styles first. We all know those stereotypes about how men and women communicate differently. Deborah Tannen talked about rapport talk, which is about building connections, and report talk, which is about conveying information.
All right, like women want to connect. Men just want to give the facts.
That's the stereotype. But research on actual communication differences is mixed.
Okay.
Some studies find small differences, but overall, the differences aren't that big.
So maybe we're not as different as we think.
Maybe not. Now, with women's development, Jean Baker Miller said that women are really important in fostering the development of others, their kids, partners, friends, and family.
So they're the caregivers and nurturers.
Yeah, but it's also important for women to have their own sense of self, their own motivation and assertiveness within those relationships.
So it's about balancing caregiving with taking care of themselves.
Exactly. And while some say that this focus on relationships is central to being a woman, others say it's not universal or necessarily a good thing.
Right, because not all women are the same.
Exactly. And we also need to consider the experiences of women of color who face unique challenges because of both their gender and their race.
Yeah, that intersectionality is important. What about men's development?
Joseph Pleck talked about role strain, which is the idea that those traditional masculine roles can be harmful to men.
Right.
Like they're told to be tough and not show emotions, which can lead to problems in their relationships and even their health.
So it's like those roles are trapping them.
In In a way, yeah. And Ron Levant suggests that men need to rethink masculinity, to separate the good parts from the bad parts, and to develop their emotional intelligence.
It's like redefining what it means to be a man.
Exactly. Now, what about aging and gender? Do those expressions and understandings change as we get older?
Good question.
Some theories say that women might become less feminine and men less masculine as they age.
So they become more similar.
Maybe, but the research is mixed. Some studies show that older men become more nurturing, but it's less clear for women. Longitudinal studies where